I never expected that a quiet afternoon in my garden would lead to one of the most honest conversations of my life. My husband's friend sat down across from me, and the truth he shared that day changed how I saw myself and the people closest to me. Where are you watching from? Tell me your city in the comments, and please remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video to support stories like this. The day started simply enough, with a soft breeze rolling through the backyard and the late sun stretching over the grass like a warm blanket. I had set out a small tray with iced tea, hoping for a moment of peace before the evening settled in. The garden was my refuge, a place where the world felt slower, where the sounds of distant traffic faded into the rustle of leaves. I was adjusting a cushion on the bench when I heard footsteps on the stone path. It was Mark, my husband's longtime friend. He often stopped by to help my husband with small projects around the house, though today he arrived earlier than expected. My husband was still out running errands. Mark paused for a moment, glancing at the empty seat across from me, as though asking for permission without words. I nodded, and he sat, folding his hands carefully on the table, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. He wasn't a man who spoke quickly. That was something I'd always noticed. He carried his words like tools, choosing the right ones with care. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt more like a gentle pause, as though the garden itself listened. "You spend a lot of time out here," he finally said, his voice low. "I can see why." I smiled, running my fingers along the rim of my glass. "It's where I go when I need space to think, or to stop thinking." He nodded slowly, watching the light shift through the trees. "I've been trying to find a place like that for myself," he said. "Lately, things feel heavier than they used to." There was sincerity in his tone, something steady but vulnerable. I wasn't used to hearing him speak this openly. It made me sit up a little straighter. "What's been weighing on you?" I asked. He hesitated, taking a measured breath. "Life changes fast," he said. "Relationships, expectations, all the things we think we should be able to handle. Sometimes I wonder if I've been carrying too much without realizing it." His honesty caught me off guard. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was simply true, the kind of truth that rises slowly but clearly. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet understanding. I knew what it meant to hold things in, to try and stay steady for everyone else. "You're not alone in that," I said gently. "We all go through seasons when everything feels heavier." He looked at me, then really looked, with an expression that held gratitude and relief. The moment was simple, but its depth surprised me. It felt as though we had stepped into a conversation neither of us planned, but both needed. The wind rustled through the garden, scattering a few petals across the table. Mark brushed one away with the edge of his hand, almost absent-mindedly. "I guess I didn't expect to talk about this today," he said. "But I'm glad I sat down." I felt the same. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the garden in soft gold, I sensed this was just the beginning of a conversation that would lead us both somewhere unexpected. The light in the garden shifted as the late afternoon settled into a calmer shade, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It wasn't silence out of awkwardness, more like the air between us had grown thoughtful, taking its time. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, his shoulders loosening as though the act of admitting his worries had let out a breath he'd held for too long. My husband still wasn't home, and I could hear the faint hum of a neighbor's mower starting up. The familiar sound grounded me, even as something inside felt subtly changed. "You know," Mark said, tracing the grain of the wooden table with his thumb, "I always thought you had everything figured out. You seem steady, the kind of person who doesn't get shaken easily." I laughed softly, surprised. "Oh, I get shaken. I just do it quietly so nobody sees." He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that softened the lines around his eyes. "Maybe that's why people talk to you," he said. "You make space without making it uncomfortable." I wasn't sure how to respond. Compliments like that always felt bigger than they sounded. So instead, I asked, "What made today feel heavier than usual?" He looked out toward the maple tree at the edge of the yard, watching the branches sway. "I've been thinking a lot about where I am in life," he said. "What I've done, what I haven't done. You get to a certain age and start wondering if you've missed something important." There was a quiet ache in his words, not regret exactly, but reflection, as though he'd been walking the same thoughts for a long time. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. "I think everyone asks themselves that at some point," I said. "It doesn't mean you've missed anything. It just means you're paying attention." He nodded but didn't look convinced. The shadows from the branches danced across his face, making his expression harder to read. "Do you ever feel like you've changed but your life hasn't caught up yet?" he asked. The question landed softly but deeply. I stared at the garden beds, the neat rows of herbs and flowers I tended to almost daily. On the surface everything looked orderly, but inside I often felt the opposite. "Yes," I said after a moment. "More than I admit. Change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, and we pretend we didn't hear it." He breathed out slowly, as if those words echoed something he'd been holding. "That's exactly it," he murmured. "I keep feeling like there's a part of me I haven't let anyone see." His honesty again reached into a place I didn't expect. I wasn't used to hearing a man speak about himself this way, gently, without defensiveness. It made the conversation feel strangely intimate, not in a romantic sense, but in the way two people can share a moment of truth without judgment. A bird landed near the edge of the table, hopping in that curious way birds do, tilting its head this way and that. Mark watched it for a moment before saying, "I'm glad it was you out here today. I don't think I could have said any of this to anyone else." The warmth of that admission settled over me. I felt the connection between us deepen, not as something forbidden, but as two people recognizing a part of themselves reflected in another. "You can talk to me," I said softly, "whenever you need." He looked at me, steady and grateful. "Thank you," he said. "I mean that." The moment lingered, quiet but full, until the sound of a car turning onto our street drifted toward us. My husband would be home soon. Mark straightened slightly, though his expression didn't close off. If anything, he looked more at peace than when he'd arrived. "I should help him unload when he gets here," he said. "But I hope we can talk again." "So do I replied. And as the car engine slowed near the driveway, I sensed that whatever had started in the shade of the garden table was only just beginning. The next morning arrived with a pale, gentle light that slipped through the kitchen window as I made coffee. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets thoughts drift without resistance. I found myself glancing toward the garden through the glass, remembering how Mark had looked sitting at that table, thoughtful, a little tired, but lighter by the time he left. I hadn't expected his honesty to stay with me the way it did, not in a troubling way, but in a thoughtful one, like a sentence you read twice because it reveals something different the second time. By midday, my husband mentioned that Mark might stop by again to help with a loose shutter on the garage. I felt a small flutter at the thought, not excitement, but something closer to anticipation of a conversation left unfinished. When Mark arrived, he greeted my husband first, and the two of them talked about tools and hinges while I tittied up the porch. I kept my attention on brushing off dust and arranging cushions, though I was aware of his presence in that subtle way you sense someone familiar approaching. After a few minutes, my husband went inside to find a drill. Mark stayed on the porch steps, wiping his hands on a cloth he pulled from his pocket. "Looks like your garden's getting ready for another bloom," he said, nodding toward the rows of flowers stretching behind the house. "They're early this year," I replied. "Everything seems to be growing faster." He gave me a knowing look, quiet but warm. Sometimes things grow when we're not expecting them to. The meaning behind his words wasn't heavy or suggestive. It was more like a shared acknowledgement of the conversation we'd had the day before. Something had shifted, and we both knew it, though neither of us pushed beyond what felt respectful. We stepped into the yard while my husband worked inside. The sun was brighter than yesterday, casting long, smooth shadows across the grass. I knelt to pinch off a few dry leaves from the basil plant, while Mark stood beside me, watching the way the light filtered through the branches overhead. "You seemed thoughtful today," he said. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, the basil leaves still between my fingers. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about feeling changed on the inside, even when life stays the same." He crouched beside me, resting his elbows lightly on his knees. "Did it feel familiar?" "Too familiar," I admitted. "I think I've been moving through my days on autopilot for longer than I realized." He nodded, and there was understanding in his eyes. Not pity, not judgment, just understanding. "It takes courage to notice that," he said. "Most people go years without looking closely." A breeze drifted through the garden, carrying the scent of rosemary and fresh soil. It brushed against us like a quiet reminder that the world kept moving even when we felt uncertain. "You know," he continued, "I didn't talk yesterday because I needed advice. I talked because I felt safe. I don't feel that often." His voice wasn't emotional in a dramatic sense. It was steady, real, and something in me softened at hearing it. "I'm glad you felt safe," I said. "Everyone deserves a place where they can speak freely." We sat there for a moment in a peaceful stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from being near someone who doesn't need anything from you except honesty. Then he glanced toward the house, where the faint sound of drilling started up. "Your husband will be looking for me in a moment," he said with a small smile. "But I'm grateful for this, for you listening." "I'm grateful you trusted me," I replied. As he stood and headed back toward the garage, I remained in the garden, touching a stem of lavender and letting the familiar scent ground me. Something inside me felt clearer, as if the conversations with Mark were helping me see myself in a new light, gently, without pressure. And though I didn't know where these small moments of connection were leading, I felt myself opening in a way I hadn't in years, not toward anything inappropriate, but toward my own long, quiet thoughts. The next few days passed in a calm rhythm, but underneath that calm, I felt a new awareness settling in. Not dramatic, not disruptive, just a quiet shift, like the way a room feels different after moving one piece of furniture. Nothing major has changed, yet everything sits differently. On the fourth afternoon, the sky hung with a soft gray, promising a light rain. I found myself in the garden again, straightening the chairs around the table as though preparing for a guest I hadn't invited. The air was cool, and the leaves trembled with the breeze, carrying the scent of coming weather. I heard the gate click before I saw him. Mark stepped in slowly, as if unsure whether he was intruding. He held a small paper bag, folded neatly at the top. "I brought you something," he said, lifting it slightly. "Fresh bread from the bakery on Maple Street. Thought you might like it." The gesture was simple, thoughtful, the kind people make when they've been paying attention. "That's very kind," I said. "Thank you." He sat across from me without needing to ask this time. The familiarity between us had grown, not in a way that crossed any lines, but in the sense that we had become two people who could share a moment without filling it with explanations. The first drops of rain began tapping gently on the table, soft and rhythmic. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about the conversations we've had. They reminded me that I don't have to hold everything so tightly." I folded my hands in my lap, listening. He wasn't speaking for dramatic effect. He was speaking the way people do when they finally find the right words. "It's strange," he continued. "You spend years trying to be the steady one, the dependable one, and somewhere along the line, you forget to check in with yourself." His words struck a familiar chord. I had lived that truth for years myself, quietly, without naming it. "I understand," I said. "Sometimes we grow so used to being strong that we stop noticing when we need support." He looked at me with a gratitude that felt warm but gentle. "You helped me remember that it's all right to speak honestly. I didn't expect that." The rain picked up slightly, creating soft circles on the patio stones. I leaned back in my chair, watching the water gather at the edge of a leaf until it fell in a tiny shimmer. "You know," I said, "these past few days made me realize something too. I've been going through my routines without asking myself what I truly feel. Talking with you made me pause, and I needed that pause more than I knew." He let out a breath that sounded almost relieved. "I'm glad it wasn't just me." "It wasn't," I said. "Not at all." For a while we simply listened to the rain, the sound filling the space between us in the most peaceful way. There was no tension, just a sense of mutual understanding that had grown naturally, respectfully, without any intention other than honesty. Mark glanced toward the house and then back at me. "I want you to know," he said, "I respect you, your husband, your home, everything. And I value what these conversations have meant. They've reminded me that real connection doesn't have to break boundaries." His words eased something inside me. They reflected what I had been feeling, that what had happened between us wasn't about crossing lines, but about discovering clarity within ourselves. "I feel the same," I said. "This has been meaningful, and it's helped me grow in ways I didn't expect." He smiled, a soft, steady smile. "That's all I hoped." The rain began to lighten, and sunlight peeked through the clouds, glinting off the wet leaves. He stood slowly, brushing a few droplets from his jacket. "I should let you get back to your afternoon," he said. "But if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here." "Thank you," I replied, "and the same goes for you." He gave a small nod and walked toward the gate, leaving the garden as quietly as he had arrived. I stayed at the table, watching the last drops fall from the branches. As the sky cleared, I felt a sense of calm settle inside me, a sense of having rediscovered a part of myself I'd let grow silent. The experience hadn't changed my life in dramatic ways, but it had changed the way I understood my own heart. And sometimes that kind of change is enough. Don't forget to subscribe the channel.